The East Wall History Group, since we started in 2011, have managed to find some real gems of hidden history or nearly forgotten history. And into that category we would include the 1911 schoolboy strike, which most people hadn't heard of, and the 1913 evictions on Merchants Road, which, as far as we're aware, are the biggest single evictions that ever took place in Dublin, when 62 families were evicted. And Hugo will mention later on, one of those evicted took part in the events at Annesley Bridge. And I think today's event, the Battle of Annesley Bridge walking tour, certainly falls into that category. It's not hidden history, but it's certainly an underexposed element of what happened in 1916. Most people, including myself, thought that there was a small skirmish. A few of the Republican forces came up to the bridge, stayed around for 2 days, and then went back to the GPO. But there's a lot more to the story, and that's what Hugo was going to tell today. And I just think we can all congratulate Hugo later on, possibly at the bar in the Annesley. But I think Hugo deserves great credit for the research he's put into this story. And I think it should be acknowledged that, as far as we're aware, this is the first time that the full story of the Battle of Annesley Bridge, the radicalisation of the whole area that led up to that, and the events that continued on for about a week afterwards. This is probably the first time it's ever been told, so I think Hugo deserves great credit for doing that. And then finally, just want to say, afterwards, we'll be finishing up near Annesley Bridge itself. We will be going into the Annesley Bridge house afterwards for refreshments. And there we have two guests who are members of the McCulloch family who lived at number 4 Annesley Bridge Road, and that's one of the locations where the civilian casualty took place. And the McCulloch family have been great in making available to us a recording of their father and grandfather telling the story of what happened on that day. So there'll be a chance to hear their story in the Annesley house. And also we'll have Eamon Carpenter, who's the son of Peter Carpenter, who was one of those who took part at Annesley Bridge as a member of the Citizen Army. And Eamon is also the grandson of Walter Carpenter, who was one of the leading figures in Dublin politics at the time, leading up to the Rising. So without further ado, I think I've gone on long enough. I'll hand you over to Hugo. And again, I just remind people, as we're going around, just be careful as we're moving around. We won't start at any location until everyone's there, so don't panic and don't rush. We never took out an insurance policy for today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. As I said, there won't be a huge amount of walking, but there's a lot of history. Before we get into it, I just want to give you a short timeline of events that led up to the Rising that will just help you to understand how things happened. Right. In 1912, the Third Home Rule Bill was brought in, and straight away it was put on hold. In order to avoid any kind of independence for Ireland, the Ulster Unionists formed the UDF in January 1913. That was followed in 1914 by the Larne gun running, and then where they imported 35,000 rifles and 5 million rounds of ammunition. In November 1913, the Citizen Army and the Irish Volunteers were formed. Then in September 1914, John Redmond called for the Irish Volunteers to join the British Army and fight in the First World War, and this led to a split and set things on the road to what turned out to be the 1916 Rising. Radicalism had started in this area as early as about 1902, when Eamon Kent, whose family lived in Clonliffe Road, was a member of the Gaelic League, and he was involved in setting up an Irish school in a place called Burns Lane, which was roughly located where Dainsford Apartments are, just out on the Clontarf Road. It went well for about 18 months until a local priest decided it was some kind of secret society, and he read the names of all the members from the altar one Sunday and threatened to expel them all from his church if it continued. So the school then reconvened later on down in Phillipsburg Avenue. But in the interim period, they spent some time here at St. Joseph's School. And that's kind of why we're starting off here. It's also just a little bit of a natural area that we can try and get everybody into. At the same time, you had all sorts of small little clubs were starting up in the area, particularly one set up by a family called Inglesby, which were trying to teach people about Irish history and Irish culture. And it was very much trying to set an Irish Ireland agenda that would get people into thinking about what it was like to be Irish. And then the IRB, which was in control of a lot of these organisations, would then try and fund them into a more revolutionary type of path. At the same time, down on the North Docks, you had a number of socialists who were in operation. One was a man called Edwin Halpin, who set up a school in which he taught principles of syndicalism and socialism, which absolutely terrified his neighbours. The other man who was in operation, and probably more important, who Joe has already mentioned, is a man called Walter Carpenter. Walter Carpenter was a labour activist, and he was one of the people who really got people engaged with politics and what their rights were. One of the real effects of his period of being involved in the North Dock can be seen in the 1908 electoral roll, with the number of people who fought in the Citizen Army who actually turned up on that roll and exercised their franchise to vote at a time when very, very few people would. Walter Carpenter was also one of the very few non-property people who actually gave evidence in the 1914 housing inquiry after the collapse of houses in Church Street. And he gave very, very damning evidence on how property was organised in Dublin and about how the landlords used corrupt practices within Dublin Corporation. As you can see, there was an awful lot of things going on in this area that would lead people into a road that would come into the 1916 Rising. Now, where we're going to go from here is we're just going to take a short walk down to Fairview Avenue. And when we get there, we're going to talk about Croydon Park, because the entrance to Croydon Park would have been down where Fairview Avenue is now, right?